So hello everyone. This is the parallel session of room number 4 on day 1 of our colloquium on from Kabuliwala to the fall of Kabul, Afghanistan in popular imagination. So today we have three excellent presentations from Bushra Mehzabeen, Bhagya Lakshmi Vivajan, and Dr. Elma Fatma. I'd like to introduce our topic for this room first, which is trauma, memory, and literature, the Afghan context. Under this category, we have the three papers. The first one of which is Trauma and the Hidden Fragmentation of Afghanistan in Nadim Aslam's fiction, which will be presented by Mushra Mehzabeen, who is a PhD researcher, Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies, University of Warwick, UK, and Assistant Professor on leave, Department of English, University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. So I would like to give the floor to Ms. Mushra Mehzabeen and ask her to start the presentation.
Thank you, Sumaya. Hello, everyone. I'm Bushra. I'd really like to thank the ULAB organizers for giving me this platform to talk about the issues that I wanted to sort of bring to the forefront, like Nadim Aslam's fiction. Today, I'll present my paper, Trauma and the Hidden Fragmentation of Afghanistan in Nadim Aslam's fiction. Nadim Aslam's novel, The Wasted Vigil, offers a depiction of the ongoing chain of violence in the 21st century Afghanistan, caused primarily by the extremist Islamic group, the Taliban. However, the narrative also highlights the war and violence stemming from the occupation of the country by multiple colonial powers, first the British, then the Soviet forces, and most recently, the Americans. This paper aims to visualize the shared despair and fragmentation of the Afghan people in the narrative. Different characters in the text exemplify the colonial legacies of their nations and the consequent fragmentation within themselves, as well as that within Afghanistan as a state. The book opens with a reference to Lara by saying, I quote, "Her mind is a haunted house," end quote, which fittingly echoes the fragmented inner states of the four central figures in Aslam's novel. They're haunted by memories of their past lives, brutally dislocated by senseless wars and repeated colonial aggression. As the narrator in the novel articulates, I quote, "The heroes of East and West are slaughtering each other in the dust of Afghanistan," end quote. A substantial portion of the narrative is shown through the characters' memories and recalling of past events. There is a strange paradox in the narrative as it negotiates between the need to visualize the human trauma and the inability to do so. The many signs, sorry, just back up. Despite sharing the same physical space, the four characters, Marcus, Lara, David, and Casa, born as Behzad, are unable to share their memories or experiences with each other. They become immobile by their trauma to express it in any meaningful way. The many signs of the trauma experienced by people witnessing wars include the will to forget or amnesia of the victim in relation to the terror of the occasion, the consequent dissociation and dislocation of the person, which generally induces a sense of fragmentation, and above all, the unspeakableness of the trauma itself. The unspeakableness of the characters' pain is a sign of their inner dislocation, which contributes to the overall sense of mystery and secrecy within the novel. The pain they feel, arguably, will never end because the wars fought throughout the history of Afghanistan is an ongoing one. As David in the story realizes, I quote, "A different war, but maybe at some level it was the same war. Just as tomorrow's wars might be begotten by today's wars, a continuation of them. Rivers of lava emerging onto the surface after flowing many out-of-sight miles underground," end quote. In this connection, Una Frawley writes that Aslam does not compress the lived experiences of his characters, Instead, he, I quote, feeds it to his readers slowly. The narrative, in fact, mimics the functioning of traumatic memory, with events of the past appearing in fragments, in intrusive flashbacks from different perspectives, never wholly experienced. End quote. Sam Durant believes in the possibility of a story of being, I quote, capable of administering the kind of shock that would liberate us from our ideological insulation and awaken us to the fact of our domination. End quote. And Nadim Aslam does use that potential in his novel. The narrator intentionally creates a tense situation for the reader, who is in a crucial position to uncover the hidden truth. However, they're not allowed to reconcile with the pain. As Sarah O'Brien writes, I quote, Aslam's novel adopts a narrative structure foregrounding Afghanistan's national trauma as a constant cause of disturbance for the reader. End quote. As Judith Butler says in her text about mourning and grieving, that whose lives are grievable, whose lives are not as we think are grievable. And for Aslam's text, the characters Zamin, she dies as a part of an American conspiracy. Katrina, her mother, dies as part of Taliban violence. So people like Marcus are not allowed to share their grief and trauma publicly. So their lives, his family's lives, the loss, they're not supposed to be grieved and they're hidden. So this hidden trauma and fragmentation of the mind is what is, this is what Aslam is trying to bring out in the text. The many wars fought on Afghan land leave their scars on the nation and the minds of the people. The Afghan people in the Wasted Vigil are continually haunted by the violence that deprived them of their cherished lives and loved ones, and often become incapable of grieving and mourning their dead, just as Lara, Marcus, and David are. Here I will quote a few lines from Abdullah Majid al-Nuaimi's poem, I Write My Hidden Longing, which may somewhat hint at the tremendous grief that people like Marcus feel, people who have lost everything because of wars and violence. My rib is broken, and I can find no one to heal me. My body is frail, and I can see no relief ahead. Al-Nuaimi wrote this poem in Guantanamo Bay as a detainee. So for him, the perspective is a bit different than Marcus's one, but the imprisonment and the fragmentation and dislocation of a person experiencing that violence of Islamic extremism and also the American war, it can be connected and sort of they are the same. Towards the end of the narrative, only Marcus remains in the war-fraught country, and all he wants, amidst all the brutality, is to simply visibilize the grief and despair which he shares with the people of Afghanistan.
Ma'am, this is your 8-minute warning.
Thank you. So I've here a bit of writing from the Wasted Vigil. Both sides in Homer's war, when they arrive to collect their dead from the battlefield, weep freely in complete sight of each other, sick at heart. This is what Marcus wants, the tears of one side fully visible to the other. As a diasporic Pakistani writer, Nadim Aslam is aware of his position of an outsider to tell the story of the Afghan people. But at the same time, he's also aware that many of his readers would be outsiders as well. Which is why Aslam taps into the language of violence and trauma to appeal to the universality of lived human experiences. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I hope you liked it.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask our audience if they have any questions after Mane regarding this presentation. If you want to ask, this is the time.
Sorry, my slides were a bit jumbled. So I don't know how that happened. So yeah.
No problem. So I think Abrar wanted to ask something. Oh, right. So Abrar has sent in a question. Dominant representations of wartime victims dehumanize them by showing them with disheveled hair or otherwise pigeonholing them. So what are you
Right.
trying to ask, Abrar? Okay. Do literary texts have a unique opportunity to nuance their experiences? Right.
Yes, thank you, Abror. I mean, of course, literature is definitely a reflection of the truth and reality of what we see every day. But the writers don't just give us facts; they give us a conceived in their own minds as well, and they try to connect it with our views, our vision, but also with the colors that they sort of uh, are bringing out from that incident. So at this moment, Nadim Aslam's another text, I think it was like the Golden Legend. There was a scene of a suicide bombing in Pakistan, and what do we normally see in bombings? That a lot of bloodshed and a lot of broken limbs, and to be not be very explicit about it, but those are the things we all know. But how Aslam sort of wrote about it was, it was like a human experience for the readers. I mean, for me at least, I not only did see a dead body, or bodies plural, but also their lives were sort of somewhat flashing by, for the reader to see and to understand that what they were feeling in the very last minute, that they were like just before they were being killed, and even a few seconds, and we see them breathing till the end, and their loved ones, one or two people were surrounding them, and then what they were feeling. So I think violence in literature becomes something, a very deep thing, and for us to understand that, it's not only to read literature, but also the connecting news, the connecting sort of theories, I think, and that will give us a holistic picture of what violence basically is doing to people, and people not only like us, but also people in Afghanistan, the women in Afghanistan, what they're facing as well. And violence can be in different forms. It just doesn't have to be very physical or brutal. It can be a continuous, a repeated form of ideological violence as well. So I think literature does show it quite a bit. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Bushra Mezabin. We'll move on to the next presentation by Mr. Bhagya Lakshmi Vijayan, who is a junior research fellow at the Department of English Studies, Central University of Tamil Nadu, India. Their topic is Testimony of Trauma and Resilience, a study of testimonial narratives by women in Afghanistan. So, Mr. Bhagya Lakshmi Vijayan, I'd ask you to start your presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. So I know it's already late, so I'll be starting with the session very soon. So the topic of discussion today is Testimony of Trauma and Resilience, a study of testimonial narratives by women in Afghanistan. So we know that we have been discussing a lot about the representations of by women in Afghanistan. So today, I'll be talking about two significant testimonial narratives from Afghanistan. So, as we all know, testimonial narratives are significant forms of life narratives which talks about significant life experiences. So, especially in an era which has given much importance to life narratives, testimonial has evolved to be a very significant genre. Testimonial is defined as a novel or a novella length narrative which talks about significant life experiences. So today I'll be talking about two important works from Afghanistan. One is Raising My Voice by Malala Joya, who is a celebrated Afghan women politician. So her testimonial, which is Raising My Voice, documents her struggle to get elected to the parliament and about her significant experiences and her fights against the warlords who were actually members of the Loya Jirga. So apart from documenting the personal life of Malalai Joya, it also testifies the collective trauma experienced by the people in Afghanistan. And the second work which I'm talking about is My Forbidden Face by Latifa. So Latifa was a teenager who aspired to become a journalist. She had great dreams about her future, but unfortunately the Taliban took over Kabul when she was about 19 years and she was about to step into her higher education, and all of a sudden she was forced to stop all her dreams about the future of becoming a journalist. And this testimonial talks about her experiences. Latifa was provided with an offer from one of her mother's associates to visit to Paris and talk about the situation of Afghan citizens, as a French magazine wanted to start an information campaign. So this testimonial documents the consequences of her decision to give a public witness account against the Taliban before an international audience. So it is seen that Taliban issued fatwa against her, and her apartment was seized by the Taliban, and she was forced to stay back in Paris. And her family was left in a country where they don't even speak their language. They had to wander in search of renewed visas and so on. So it was completely a difficult position for Latifa and her family, because her family members were scattered at different places and they were supposed to stay back in Paris. So Latifa has completely lost all her dreams about receiving education too. So this is what her works talks about. So these are the two works which I'm talking about today. So it can be seen that these works are very much significant because, being testimonial narratives, these are not merely their personal experiences. There are a lot of significant things they talk about in these works. It talks about the traumatic experiences of the community as a whole. First of all, about the childhood scattered at the refugee camps. It can be seen that Malalai was a person who was brought up in refugee camps. She was forced to flee from one refugee camp to another during her young ages. So she represents the trauma of people, of children whose childhood is scattered at refugee camps. So there were many significant problems which they faced there. They were forced to flee from one refugee camp to another, and as a result, they were not able to enjoy their childhood in any way. So she represents the trauma of dislocation, especially at a very young age. They faced a lot of problems. They were facing ostracization from the natives of other countries. They were not given the ability to have good education, and they had to face very unhygienic conditions in the camps. So this had very serious impacts on the self-formation of the children. So that is one of the significant experience which they talks about, the trauma of being dislocated, especially at a very young age. Then, as we know, the victimization of women was the most significant problem faced by these women in Afghanistan. As we know, the women were the worst victims of the rules established by the Taliban. We've already seen what are the regulations or restrictions imposed upon the women in Afghanistan by the Taliban. They were supposed to cover themselves in burqas. They were not provided opportunities to educate themselves or to follow their career aspirations. As we have seen in the case of Latifa, many of the young children were forced to stop their education at a very young age. And they were completely supposed to be dependent upon the men. So it was certain strategies which were utilized to limit the abilities of the women and to make them completely dependent upon the men. So it can be seen that the religious rules are often used as a strategy to legitimize the oppression of women in Afghanistan. So there were certain mandates which made it compulsory that women should always be followed by male relatives, and these were actually meant to infantilize the women in Afghanistan, to brand that the women were not really capable to do anything of themselves. Then another significant problem was the compulsory religious education, which is actually meant to manipulate the religious laws in order to achieve the aims of the Taliban. So we know that the men in Afghanistan were compulsorily enrolled in madrasas and the women were refused education of any kind. And then these narratives also talks about the ostracization of religious minorities. We have seen how the Taliban has limited the possibilities of minorities in Afghanistan, the destruction of the Buddhist statues by the Taliban. All these shows how the Taliban has been trying to eliminate the multicultural heritage of Afghanistan and to establish that this was completely an Islamic nation where no other religion has any significant position. So these are the significant experiences which it talks about. So we can see that these testimonial narratives are significant because these are not merely novels or any fictional work, but these are about the self-experiences which they talks about. So through these testimonial narratives, Malala Joya and Latifa are able to extend their selves as traumatized human subjects beyond the territorial borders. So when they talk about their experiences, it is not merely a woman from Afghan talking about their problems, but this is a problem which has a global dimension. So their life narration, which combines political events of Afghanistan with a personal story, blurs the distinction between the private and the public. So their very private lives is becoming very significant things which needs to be discussed even at a higher level. So they represent the collective experiences and thus becomes a voice for the voiceless citizens who lacks the ability or the agency to talk about their own experiences. So that is why testimonial narratives are even important, because they are giving a voice to people who are denied a voice to talk about themselves. And the Participation in Testimonial Act provides an opportunity for the victim or survivor to testify the torment that they had to encounter under oppressive regimes. This invites global attention to instances of human rights violations and induce action against such violations. So we know that many of the people who have been associating with the victims have said that they were so much influenced by these narratives and they were very much moved by these and they were initiated into social action against these types of violations. And especially the act of publishing a testimonial narrative in printed form and in a language which is easily accessible to the people provides its more accessibility and global attention. And thus it provides a wider platform to discuss the instances of trauma and human rights violations. And it encourages us to empathize with them and to take steps to interfere into these kinds of problems.
Right. Ms. Bhatia, your 10 minutes are up. So if you could wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay, ma'am. So I would like to conclude this presentation by saying that these narratives are also narratives of resistance, because this narration of testimonial narratives against dominant discourses is an act of resistance against any kind of oppression that women faces. So these narratives, which document the struggles of Afghan women against the tyranny of Taliban, provides witness accounts of the traumatic experiences that the Afghan citizens encounter. And living under a regime which restricts the basic freedoms of life, writing against the regime itself is a significant act of resistance. I would like to conclude my presentation with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bhatia. You have one question from our student Abrar Zaman. So Abrar is asking if burqa is a strategy to enslave women and depersonalize them, and deveiling women, like in France, is similarly taking away the autonomy of women. How can society best ensure that women are given the option to choose for themselves when many ideologies constantly strive to indoctrinate them and influence their choices?
Okay.
So it's the two polar opposites. One side is trying to robe them in burqas, and one side is trying to take their burqas off by force. So how do we make sure that the women are actually given the choice to do what they want for once?
Okay, I think this needs an interference from the global authorities like the UN and such international authorities which works for peace and freedom of women. So we should be able to ensure that women are able to uh, exercise their choices, especially by educating them and making them aware of their rights and making them possible to deliberately oppose these kinds of strategies to enslave them and depersonalize them.
I have a follow-up question with that. So they are protesting against it. The thing
Yeah.
is, they are being forced. So with laws, with repercussions, they're being forced to do what the authority wants to do. So isn't it a problem that we should, take up with the authority itself? Shouldn't we change the system?
Yes, it's definitely a change in the system is needed from the beginning. I mean, this oppression is not something which happens all of a sudden. It is something which is happening at the very systematic level, right from the families. So these kinds of attitudes should be changed right from the beginning by uh, empowering the women and making them able to resist these kinds of problems.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bhagia. I would like to invite our third and final presenter of the day, Dr. Elham Fatma. Um, um, hello,
Hello.
hello.
Yes.
So if you could mute your mic for a second while I'm announcing your topic, then right. It's causing an echo, that's why. So Dr. Elham Fatma has just finished her PhD from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IRT Roorkee from India, and her topic is Siddiq Barmak's movie Osama, portrayal of Afghan single women's trauma and stereotypes about Islamic culture under Taliban's regime. So, Miss Dr. Elham Fatma, please, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hello, everyone present over here. So thank you very much. The esteemed audience present over here and my dear chair, I'm Ilham Fatma. As you have already given my introduction to the audience, I did my PhD in Kashmiri women and their trauma in the context of contemporary Kashmiri fiction. So today's my talk actually engages with the text that is a movie called as Osama, and it is directed by Siddiq Barma. It was released in the year 2003. So the title of my presentation is Siddiq Barma's movie Osama, portrayal of Afghan single women's trauma and stereotype about Islam under the Taliban regime. So this movie, let me give you a brief idea about it, what this presentation is about. So abstract to presentation. This movie is about an Afghan priest girl who in the male government province, Kabul, earns living in the guise of a boy in the absence of men in her family. But the revelation of her identity, let me give you a brief idea, the abstract to the presentation. So this movie, Osama, is all about a Afghan preteen girl who in the male-governed province, Kabul, earns living in the guise of a boy in the absence of men in her family. But the revelation of her identity calls upon the wrath of the Taliban during their regime before 9/11. So regaining control after 20 years, they are perceived to complicate women's fundamental rights. Therefore, Osama, I believe, would now be referred to for the portrayal of passive Afghan women with no agency and men as misogynist, abusive, oppressive in the current politically volatile situations. Now, in this presentation, I would critically review this movie to argue that it depicts reality, but simultaneously promotes a particular ideology that acts as a framework which contributes to shaping the new Orientalist perspective about Islam as a religion of inequality, violence, extremism, and injudiciousness towards women's right and well-being. So in a disagreement with the Taliban's distortion of Sharia rules concerning women's marriage purdah shown in the movie, this presentation would also focus on the Quranic injunctions and then that need to be brought to light in response to the widely held notions rife against Muslim women. So now this presentation comprises 3 parts. With the audience present here, I would now come down to the first part by sharing the synoptic idea of the movie. So one of the attention drawing scenes immediately after the opening of Osama shows the women's right agitation going on in Kabul as the homogeneous crowd of burqa-clad women throng the streets to call for their basic rights. So literally as the personification of helplessness, they raise their voice regarding the right to work by stating their apolitical stances and challenges they encounter as widows or poor mothers with children. Now their demonstrations come to an abrupt end with the Taliban's entry. They ruthlessly open fire on a crowd and literally shoot them using water cannon. Now, on the fringe of the fray, a widow with her 12-year-old daughter watched from a doorway before frantically running for their lives together with a street urchin named Espendi. Then a few subsequent scenes focus on the mother's inability to procure a safe and decent job despite being a medical caregiver. So at the beginning of the movie, she is shown to evade the security threats inside the hospital, raided and closed by the Taliban, and later on dares to undertake a couple of other perilous enterprises along with her daughter, but eventually given in. Now, legally refrained from going out without the company of men and having no men in the family, the widow with her mother devises a very minacious plan to disguise her daughter as a boy and literally enforce her to work with an acquaintance in his tea stall. Now, giving her fragile being and feminine voice, the tea stall owner tries to protect her, but a street urchin Espendi's attempts are commendable when she saves her from the fellow boys, bullying when she's taken by the Taliban to sit with them in the madrasa that gives the teaching of the Quran as well as military training. In fact, in a desperate attempt to prove her a boy, it is Espendi who gives her a very masculine name, Osama, to the satisfaction of the jeering boys. Now, with the passing of time, the young female impersonator's fear and apprehension remain conspicuous, but simply avoided by her mother and grandmother under the duress of their abject penury and no source of income. However, it does not take long before she is discovered and her masquerade ruse fails tragically. Now, the concluding part of the climax of the movie becomes highly perturbing. I quote here R.J. Cajulo's expression in the following word as he writes, imprisoned and put on trial before a fundamentalist Islamic court, along with other enemies of people, Osama is sentenced to death. While she is spared, but later on she is spared, but only to endure a fate, according to Burmak's face, which convinces us that was far worse than death, to become the latest wife of the decrepit yet lecherous mullah from the bathhouse scene, who has insidiously worked to obtain her pardon from the Taliban's leading cleric and who magisterially lets this girl choose her bridal gift of a lock and chain. Now, following the overview of this movie, coming fast to the second part of this presentation that deliberates upon the impressions it casts on viewers and instigates responses which could be diverse, discursive, including prejudice. Now, I would like to focus on the section I have entitled in my presentation PPT as Osama and New Orientalism, Stereotypical Representations of Afghan and Islam under the Taliban regime. Indeed, the movie effectively engages the plight of an Afghan girl, her widowed mother who lost her husband to civil war, and her widowed mother who lost her son to the war in the Soviet Union. These single women undoubtedly undergo an overwhelming pain, grief, and sorrow. Furthermore, their impoverished life, hunger, fear of being attacked and assaulted by men who are aware of their staying alone, and most importantly, the rigid regulations on earning money, going out alone, and observing the strict purdah with the Taliban's unkind behavior towards them are some of the factors resulting in their psychological and social trauma that anyone can accept are very well documented in the movie. But I argue that such scenes trigger in viewers' minds the preconceived notions about the status of Afghan Muslim men and women and the popular tropes of injustice and violence associated with Islam. They can effectively provide the strong grounds to new Orientalists to reinforce the perceptions about Muslim that viewers often already have even before they set out to watch the movie. Let me give a brief, or rather cursory idea about an ideologically driven movement promulgating these days within the discipline of humanities situated in the West. Thus, there is no new Orientalism. A reviewed and extended version of Orientalism, far from giving an accurate representation of Islam and Muslim, it emphasizes exclusively on what are considered the negative dimensions and components of the Islamic faith and culture, or the alleged behavior of the Muslim. A number of scenes in the movie deal with the lucid generalization of women's life in relation to men's authority over them and the maintenance of the gender order that strengthen the new Orientalism tenets. For example, the protagonist suffering on account of being a young girl disguised as a boy to earn money implies that under old circumstances, women cannot work and dare to be dependent. And her concealment of her sex is the transgression to which the strict punishment is meted out to her. She is penalized to marry a man old enough to be her grandfather in the absence of her guardians. Before her fate is decided, it is shown in the movie that on the charges of adultery, a European doctor is stoned to death in the absence of witnesses, signifying yet another pristine practice consistent with the manifestation of barbarism, where misogyny is seen as deeply rooted in indigenous culture. Now, all women seemingly victimized are highly subversive in their actions to work out and maneuver the violent and inextricable situations that have developed in their lives, and they are taking part in public demonstration and resistance to their social institutions are not deemed as fitting to their dignity as Muslim women. Besides them, the men sympathetic and considerate towards them women, such as employer of Osama and Espendi, are shown to be very meek and effeminate in their demeanor. The former, tired of the ruthlessness of the Taliban regime, escapes to Pakistan, and Espendi, at the fate of Osama, weeps badly. While an American director who has come to shoot a documentary is killed by the Taliban on the grounds of blasphemy. His end is in response to the ideology of West and Islam dualism. The male characters, particularly the Taliban, are shown to be, as expected, backward, violent, lecherous, and irrational, caught in a barbaric past who are unable to come to terms with modernity. A viewer's impression gathered from the movie about Muslim men and women, I argue precipitates a resistance to Islam, stereotypes that goes in conjunction to the expositions of the burgeoning ideologically motivated agenda called as neo-Orientalism, which strengthens stereotypes, prototypes, proposes new understandings, and furtively flickers Islamophobia. The movie, made in 2003, would now be interpreted as highly contemporary in broaching the subjects of conflict, political turmoil, the subjugation of women, and widespread violence Afghans are currently struggling with, given the ways the Taliban in the current social and political context are bent upon imposing the Sharia rules. However, with their partial understanding of them, including their manipulation, I would conclude this talk by citing the apt Quranic injunctions, usually sidelined by extremists, owing to the exercise of personal authority, inevitably correlated to misogyny, hypocrisy, and toxic hegemonic masculinity. So I have concluded citing four Quranic verses. The one that deals with the rights of men and women in general. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 2 to 6, the Quran says that for women are rights over men similar to those of men over women. And as far as education is concerned, Surah Al-Alaq, verse 1 to 5 says that read in the name of your Lord who has created. He has created a man from a cloth. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who has taught by the pen, and he has taught man that which he knew not. So I've tried to say,
Dr. Fatma, your 10 minutes are up. If you could wrap up in 10 seconds.
So that's how I would like to conclude my talk, that the movie indeed depicts reality, but somewhere it responds well to the tenets of neo-Orientalism, emancipating or being shaped or being propagated by the humanities discipline from the Western world. And somehow it proves the stereotypes being discussed and forwarded by them. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation, Dr. Fatma. Since we have run out of time for this session, we won't be able to do a question-answer session, sadly. But I would like to thank all presenters.